Okay, hi. Um, so I want to start by going over abstraction again a little bit. Oh, I guess I should announce, first of all, that the first metaphysics exercise is due tomorrow. Um, the second one is already up. The second and third ones are already up, even though they're not due for a while. And
Do you want to use the desk?
hello? Okay.
Oh,
Hello? Is someone not muted on purpose or, oh, okay, I don't know.
yeah, that was an accident.
Oh, okay, fine. Um, so,
Maybe just one sec. Also, the discussion is just a reminder, is there for people to post their questions and answer each other's questions until Thursday night. If you could reiterate, please. Thank you.
yeah. Oh, and also, I didn't have time to check my email since for hours. Anna and Sean, did you set up links for your office hours?
I'm going to do it tonight and send to you.
Okay. Okay. Great. All right. So I wanted to go over abstraction again a little bit. Both because I kind of rushed through it a little bit last time, and also because it ties into the reading for this week as well. Let me just, all right. So, and actually, I got this all set up, and the very first thing I'm going to do is take it apart and try the document camera. Although, but by the way, I didn't get around to setting up a poll or anything, but are there any like quick reactions about the document camera? Is that good or bad? Okay. So it's okay. All right. So I'll keep doing it then. So that means the first thing I have to do is stop this share and change to this now. So so page 155 in this edition, which again is book 2, chapter 11, section 9. Oops. Right, so this is where Locke actually describes the process of abstraction. And I mean, this is going to be really important when we try to figure out what it is that Berkeley disagrees with Locke about or thinks he disagrees with Locke about. So, so this is what the mind does in order to form these general abstract ideas, which is done by considering them. Sorry, to prevent this, the mind makes the particular ideas received from particular objects to become general, which is done by considering them as they are in the mind, such appearances, separate from all other existences, and the circumstances of real existence. This is called abstraction. Well, I didn't read the end of the sentence, but anyway, separate from and the circumstances of real existence as time, place, or any other concomitant ideas. This is called abstraction, whereby ideas taken from particular beings become general representatives of all of the same kind, and their names general names, applicable to whatever exists conformable to such abstract ideas. Such precise, naked appearances in the mind, without considering how, whence, or with what others they came there, the understanding lays up with names commonly annexed to them as the standards to rank real existences into sorts, etc., etc. Right? So again, what I was emphasizing about this last time is that in a sense, Locke thinks that all the ideas we have are already abstract. It's due to our confusion that we don't notice that, oh, and I'm making gestures at the camera and you can't see me, but there is one other thing I want to read, so I'm going to leave it on the document canyon for a second. So in a sense, Locke thinks that all our ideas are already abstract, right? That as you consider them as they are, as precise and naked, without considering how, whence, or with what others they came there. But if you look at the idea itself the way it really is, then you'll see that it can be separated from all those other ideas and all the circumstances it came in with. So, and in a sense, you're only seeing it that way correctly you're only seeing it correctly for the first time when you see it that way. So, so this is chapter 2, book 2, chapter 13, section 13. It's from today's reading, and a man may consider light in the sun. A man may consider light in the sun without its heat, or mobility in body without its extension, without thinking of their separation. So what that means is that you may think of the idea of light, for example, without the idea of heat, without representing light and heat as separated in the external objects. So now let me switch back to
Wash your hands now. What?
So, and I think when he says a man, I haven't really talked about his use of man and he and him yet. Maybe I'm going to put that off a little bit though, because I want to talk about this first. So, the sun causes two different simple ideas in me. This is, so far, this is all the same thing I said last time. This is the idea of light. This is the idea of heat. The sun causes both of those. The qualities that cause both of those can't be separated from each other in the sun. You can't take the bright part away from the hot part. But I think what Locke really wants to say is, I should. I must, if I'm going to keep things clear, separate these ideas in my mind without representing them as separate in the external object. And this was the thing I kind of rushed through at the end last time, I think. Now I'm going to bring it to the document camera and read the passage. So, oops, not that. This. This is back in book 1. So book 1, chapter 2, section 15. Well, actually, I was going to read down here, but let me actually start with this part up here. The senses at first let in particular ideas and furnish the yet empty cabinet. And the mind by degrees growing familiar with some of them, they are lodged in the memory and names got to them. Afterwards, the mind proceeding farther abstracts them and by degrees learns the use of general names. Right, so maybe this should be a little closer. There we go. So, and remember, this is a little bit puzzling because these particular ideas are complex, and at least, oops, all those pages just turned back. Fred there. That's Fred, my pet rock. He was my pet rock when I was a kid, and then my daughter Margaret found him and decorated him some more. That's why he has like sparkles on him now. Anyway, it's a bit of a puzzle because you think a particular name, right? Or you could put it this way: what are the first kinds of ideas that infants get? Are they ideas like sweet, warm, pain, right? That is simple ideas. Or are they ideas like mama, nurse, Fred, and so forth? That is particular ideas. So, on the one hand, Locke seems to say that we get simple ideas first and then we make complex ideas out of them. So it would seem to suggest that simple ideas like warm and so forth are the ones that come in first. But then, on the other hand, he says that we first get particular ideas and then abstract from them. So, so it's a puzzle, and that's what I was trying to abstract. But I'm trying to explain by that explanation of abstraction. So, if you look down here at the bottom, for a child knows as certainly before it can speak the difference between the ideas of sweet and bitter. That is, that sweet is not bitter, as it knows afterwards when it comes to speak that wormwood and sugar plums are not the same thing. So the child did acquire those simple ideas first. But how is that consistent with saying that the child acquired particular ideas first? Well, notice that the things that it's going to tell the difference between when it knows how to speak are abstract ideas, wormwood and sugar plums. Those are abstract, complex ideas. They're ideas of substances, according to the classification that Locke has now introduced. They're abstract ideas of substances, right? Because it's not the idea of some particular piece of wormwood or some particular sugar plum. It's the idea of a sugar plum in general. The child first got simple ideas like sweet and bitter, and then much later on formed these abstract ideas like wormwood and sugar plums. What's the other one? All right. Go back to this. So how does that make sense? And what I was claiming last time was that the way it makes sense is this. When the child first sees and feels the sun, for example, so what actually comes in are these simple ideas of light and heat. The child, although it knows perfectly well that light is not heat, it hasn't discerned them from each other. It's not keeping them straight as separate. So what the child first gets is light and heat kind of like glommed together, confused with each other. Confusion is the opposite of distinction or distinctness, right? It means fused together, like flowing together, confusion, right? So the child gets confused ideas of light and heat that are not clearly separated from each other. And also, but I think maybe rather than also, we should even say therefore, not separated from the occasion, the time and place where they came in. And the reason I say maybe we should even say therefore is that the point here is that what puts these two things together is not the infant's mind. The infant's mind hasn't decided to put light and heat together to make one idea. Rather, what puts them together is the sun, basically, right? It's by the sun causing these two ideas together at a particular place in time that they get confused with each other, associated with each other, so to speak, put into one particular idea, but it's a confused particular idea. Is that clear so far? I think my chat window disappeared again. I hate this. Are there questions about that so far? Okay, so and that's why when Locke goes on to discuss the so to speak, the higher operations of the mind, the things that come after perception, the first one he discusses is discernment. Right, this is in chapter 11 of discerning and other operations of the mind. I'm not going to put this in a document viewer because I don't think there's something here I want to read, but just if you look at the beginning of chapter 11 of book 2, it's all about discernment. And the point is that our ideas are confused until we discern them. So the reason I'm saying that's discussed first is because that's the very first thing that the infant does. Okay, there's a question here. Would something like synesthesia pose a problem for this division of simple ideas? I mean, I think Locke could explain synesthesia, could say what it must be like, according to him, in a way that's consistent with his doctrine of simple and complex or confused ideas or whatever. Whether that would be the right description of synesthesia, I mean, I think Locke would probably, I think his hypothesis would be that synesthesia happens because early on I formed some tight association between two different ideas. And so they're confused to the point where I can't discern them from each other. And we'll see that he talks about that in general. He thinks that's a major source or the source of irrationality. So he might consider synesthesia to be an example of that. That it's only seems to me like, I don't know, like the number 3 is yellow or a high C or whatever these examples of synesthesia are. It seems that to me because the ideas are so closely associated in my mind. But whether that would be a right description of synesthesia, whether someone who experiences synesthesia could accept that, I don't know. And also it would be an empirical, as it should be, he's an empiricist, right? It would be an empirical claim. You would have to go and see, is it true that, can synesthesia really be explained by early associations? In principle, you could try to find that out. I don't know how you would set up the study exactly, but in principle, that's something you could find out. And it might be wrong. So I don't know, does that answer the question somewhat? I guess maybe another way that would be a more direct answer to the question is, if synesthesia really meant that, I don't know, that for me, for someone who has this, I don't think I have experience of synesthesia, or anyway, not very strong ones. But for people who report these as very strong, they'll say like, a high C really is bright yellow. Like, I don't know how you can't see that. It's so obvious to me that a high C is bright yellow. At least that's what I've heard. I've never talked to anyone about this, but I've just read things. So if it's really true that for someone or other, a high C really is bright yellow, would Locke be in trouble? I mean, he might be able to explain it. I shouldn't spend too much more time on this. It is really interesting. So, when philosophers talk about the history of philosophy, they usually spend a lot of time talking about what the philosopher would have said about something they don't actually discuss. And historians, I believe, find that kind of frustrating, real historians. They're like, what do you mean what they would have said? They didn't talk about that. What are you talking about? But it really is, I mean, it's important for what we're doing with the history of philosophy, in philosophy, like to try to learn to think like Locke. What would he say, So, I mean, I think what he could say is that perhaps due to a problem in their, in the organization of their brain or something, however these connections are explained, it's actually the case that the thing that, or I guess if you take two different things here, one is like a yellow flower and one is like a that's supposed to be a violin or some stringed instrument. So one is like a violin playing high C, right? So those are two different things. And in a quote unquote normal person who doesn't have this synesthetic experience, they cause the perception of two different ideas, high C and yellow. But maybe for some people, because their brain is organized differently or for whatever reason, these two things both cause the same idea. And so, like, every time this person sees something yellow, they perceive a certain idea. And every time they hear a high C, they perceive the same idea. And therefore, for them, there really is just one idea. But to explain it to us, they have to say a high C looks yellow. That's another way he could approach it. Okay, I hope that's helpful. I don't have more time to talk about that, I think. So the first operation is discernment. And it's the first operation, I think, that Locke wants to say that infants perform after perception. In fact, not here, but somewhere back in book 1, he actually said he thinks this begins as soon as memory begins to operate.
Definitely read more.
But what it sounds like here from the beginning of chapter 11 is although that we begin being able to carry out that operation as soon as memory begins to operate, we don't necessarily do it. We have to actually do it, and it takes a long time to do it to the point where we have relatively clear ideas. So that's like an early thing that infants do. And it's also the operations in chapter 11 are in order, I think, in the order we actually carry them out, both as we're growing up and in the formation of any abstract idea, even when we are grown up. This is the order the operations come in, but it's also kind of like an order from more universal to all animals to more specifically human, right? So remember, Locke says about perception that he conjectures that perception is what just makes the difference between animals and all other beings, right? I mean, I guess specifically the ones that are closest to animals, you might say, are plants, right? And he says that although plants react, they don't have perception. I don't know exactly how we know that, but anyway, that's his conjecture. Whereas every animal, no matter how simple, has some kind of perception. So whatever the evidence for that is, I'm not really sure. That's his view. But then as he goes through chapter 11 and talks about these other operations, he says more and more, I don't think animals do this. I don't think animals do this very much. I don't think animals do this properly speaking. And then when he gets to abstraction, he says, this is something animals he says beasts, actually. Beasts means non-human animals, right? So this is something that non-human animals just don't do at all. So discernment is something that non-human animals, at least the ones that are more similar to us, do somewhat, is what he says. But then as you go through, you find things that they do less and less of. And the second one is compounding. So compounding, obviously, is what you need to do to have a complex idea. Compounding means putting simple ideas together. But again, you might ask, wait, I erased the infant's view and drew up the synesthete's view. All right. Right. So again, you might say, well, look, isn't this idea, which is light and heat glommed together, isn't that a complex idea? It's not a simple idea. Or I guess another way to put it is, what's the difference between this and a complex idea. And I kind of already said that, namely, the difference is why they're put together. But I think Locke himself addresses this explicitly at the beginning of chapter 12. So, so here's the beginning of book 2, chapter 12. As simple ideas are observed to exist in several combinations united together, so the mind has a power to consider several of them united together as one idea, and that not only as they are united in external objects, but as itself has joined them. Ideas thus made up of several simple ones put together I call complex. So the key here to what makes a complex idea is that it's not just a bunch of simple ideas that I'm not bothering to distinguish between, that are kind of coming in at the same time, and therefore I think of them all together. Rather, it's simple ideas that I myself have put together. So the key here is the source of unity. That the formation, oh, I wrote that on the board, but you can't see the board. Oops. Screen. Chat window back. Oh, and actually, oh no, okay, I think you could see it when I drew that. So the question is, if we have, this is light, and this is heat. Like what the infant gets is light associated with heat because they're there at the same time in the same place. So that's a confused particular idea. So like that's the kind of idea that the infant, or for that matter, that a non-human animal might have of some particular thing. Right? Like Locke says that, you know, a dog's idea of its master can be, actually, he tries to phrase this precisely, and I didn't write down exactly where it is. But he, wait, it's not true that compounding is second. I skipped comparing, but that's okay. Roots abstract not, it'll be before that. Oh, compounding. Yeah, so here it is. Switch this back to it. No, maybe I won't switch it. I'm just going to read this. It's about a dog's idea of its master. As possible, okay, in this also, I suppose, brutes come far short of men. Brutes means the same thing as beasts. Brutes come far short of men, for though they take in and retain together several combinations of simple ideas, as possibly the shape, smell, and voice of his master make up the complex idea a dog has of him, or rather are so many distinct marks whereby he knows him. Right? So what he's saying is the dog's quote unquote complex idea of its master is not really a complex idea. It's just a whole bunch of ideas, any one of which, if it senses that, will represents its master. And again, it's because it hasn't sufficiently discerned between them. And that's why it can't, strictly speaking, compound them to make a complex idea. Whereas as the infant grows up, it discerns its ideas better and better, and then it starts to put them together for its own reasons rather than just because they came in together. And at first, before it starts abstracting, that's still going to be a kind of particular idea, but it's a really different kind of particular idea than it had before, and a really different kind than the dog has. Because again, it's as Locke says, the mind can put these things together itself and then can turn them into a standard for whether something else agrees with them. So even a particular idea, if I've put it together myself, I can then, it's like my putting it together, and then I see, does the object agree? Whereas the infant only has things put together the way the object has put them together. So in other words, so the steps are, right, number one, confused particular idea. Number two, discernment of the pieces within the particular idea. Number three, putting them back together to make a complex idea, a complex particular idea. And then finally, number four, abstraction.
You know what? I'm not listening to this. I find it so interesting.
Is there a question? Or did someone just get unmuted? Okay. Right, or so I guess finally, another way of putting this would be that if you ask what kind of ideas do we get first, abstract ideas or particular ideas? The answer is, well, the ideas we get first are in themselves abstract if you view them correctly, because they're simple ideas. But they come in not abstracted, but the opposite of abstraction is concretion. They come in concreted, like joined to, grown together is what concrete means. They come in like grown together with other ideas. And yet that's not yet the kind of concretion that can serve as the basis of abstraction, because it's passive concretion. So this first confused idea is ideas that come together because of the way the object is affecting me. And that has to be replaced by active concretion before I can carry out abstraction. I think that's Locke's view. Obviously, I've said a lot of things that Locke doesn't say particularly clearly, just putting together what he says in different places, but I think that's the best I can do to make sense of all these things put together. And again, I don't, like if you said, no, the real explanation is that Locke just isn't careful, doesn't know, hasn't really decided whether the simple or the particular, or the, you know, abstract or particular ideas come first. Remember, those two quotes I read were from the same paragraph in book one, where at the beginning of the paragraph, he said, we get particular ideas first. And at the end of the same paragraph, he said, that the child first learns the difference between sweet and bitter, and only later between wormwood and sugar plums. Presumably he didn't forget between the first sentence of the paragraph and the last sentence of the paragraph. Right. The difference, so someone just asked, the difference between animals and infants is that as infants grow up, they put simple ideas together for their own reasons, rather than just because those ideas came together. Um, um, yeah, or I mean, that's the key part of the difference I'm focusing on here, right? It starts with discernment, that the infants are better at discernment than the animals. Um, and then because of that, it turns out that the animals don't compare or compound or do so very little, because in order to do that, you have to have first done discernment. And so they don't end up with any complex ideas at all, or only with very few, and not like ones that are usable for as the basis for abstraction, something like that. And therefore, they certainly don't abstract at all. That's like the full tale of how the infant grows up and the animal remains an animal. By the way, if you said, I mean, actually, we're going to see Locke talking about questions just like this, hypothetically at least. But so I think in this case, I'm fairly confident. If you said to Locke, look, chimpanzees can learn language, or gorillas, or parrots, or right? I mean, that is that maybe in Locke's time, and I guess like since forever, people have thought that parrots for the most part are just making noises and they don't know what it means. But if you say, look, the latest research indicates that they can kind of understand what it means, like at least the more intelligent ones, not my brother's parrots, I think, but some other parrots, African grays. So like, so, you know, by what right do you say that only humans can abstract, that other animals can't do it? Locke will say, oh, I guess they can. Right? I mean, this is an empirical statement. As far as Locke knows, as far as people have experienced, humans are the only animals who do this. But if you pointed out that no, actually, the difference between humans and other animals isn't marked out by this distinction, and you showed empirical evidence, Locke would be fine with that. And he's even going to use that fact to later explain what kind of idea the idea of human is. The fact that if we discovered, he actually uses the example of an alleged rational parrot. He says, you know, what would we say about the rational parrot? Would we say it's a human that looks like a parrot? No, we would say it's a rational parrot. And that shows that rational isn't part of the definition of human. Okay. So now I want to go on and talk about the classification of ideas into complex and simple, and then some other stuff. But before I do that, are there any questions about abstraction? Okay. So I'm going to erase this. Classification of complex ideas. So all ideas in general are divided into simple and complex. And then complex ideas are divided into modes, substances, or ideas of substances. So, right, like the way Locke talks about this isn't completely symmetrical. He could have said ideas of modes, ideas of substances, ideas of relations, or he could have said modes, substances, relations, but actually he says modes, ideas of substances, and relations, usually. So, and there's reasons for that, but it's nevertheless, it's kind of confusing. So these are the three main headings, the different types of complex ideas. And then under modes, there's a further distinction between simple modes and mixed modes. Now, I'm pointing this out right away because this is very confusing, right? A simple mode is not a simple idea. A simple mode is a kind of complex idea because a mode is a kind of complex idea. The most of the rest of the reading for today was about simple modes because he discusses simple modes first. And so he's going to talk a lot more. He's going to talk about mixed modes. Mixed modes turn out, although they include some very important ideas like beauty and courage, and right, like those are all mixed modes. So mixed modes are supposed to include some very important ideas according to Locke, but it turns out that there isn't as much to say about them. So he's going to deal with those relatively quickly, and then he's going to spend a lot of time talking about ideas of substances and ideas of relations. So I think the time to discuss this classification in general will be more as we move on to those other parts, but I'll just say that the type of complex idea that a mixed mode is, or sorry, that a mode is, and, you know, really, I think possibly these kind of go together. You might call these positive ideas and these relative ideas. So anyway, because a relation is, as Locke is going to say, it's like one idea, looking out from one idea towards another one or something like that. So it's quite different from the others. These are both ways that simple ideas are just kind of put together. But the difference between them is that in the case of mode, or maybe I should say it the other way. In the case of substance, I represent them as being together because of the nature of some external object. Right, so an example of an idea of substance would be my idea of gold. And if my idea of gold contains yellow, fusible, and soluble in aqua regia, then beyond that, the idea of gold includes the fact that there's some subject in which the qualities that cause those ideas are found. And that's what I really think of as gold. So that's what the idea of a substance is like, as opposed to the idea of, or as opposed to a mode, which, so an example of that would be yellow. Although, well, see, that's a simple idea. That's already confusing. When we take the example, the type of example Locke talks about, like courage, right? So the idea of courage doesn't contain the thing that has courage. It's just a property that something might have. It might have qualities that go together in a certain way. So that, roughly speaking, is the difference between modes and substances. Well, again, we'll see a lot more about that when we start talking about substances, especially. But for now, I want to talk about, because as I said, most of the reading for today is about simple modes. I want to talk about the difference between simple modes and mixed modes, and in particular, what is supposed to be special about a simple mode. And so a simple mode is supposed to be a mode in which the simple ideas that are put together are all the same. Or anyway, there isn't more than one kind of simple idea involved in forming it. So an example, maybe the only example, or maybe not, of a way we form simple modes is the example of enlarging, which he already discussed in chapter 11. So now I'm going to switch back to that. Oh, wait, end share. Switch to page 160. Well, maybe I was already on page 160. Oh no, sorry, it's 154. 160 is the passage I want to look at next. Right, so under this operation of composition, may be reckoned also that of enlarging, wherein, though the composition does not so much appear as in more complex ones, yet it is nevertheless a putting several ideas together, though of the same kind. Thus, by adding several units together, we make the idea of a dozen, and putting together the repeated ideas of several perches, we frame that of a furlong. I have no idea how long a perch or a furlong is, but anyway, those are old-fashioned length units. So basically, enlarging is an operation where we make a bigger idea by putting together a bunch of simple ideas of the same kind. Such as the simple idea of a unit. This is the passage I wanted to show you on page 160. Well, okay, actually, let me talk about enlarging first. No, actually, let me do this first so I won't have to keep switching back and forth. So this is the definition of simple modes. First, there are some which are only variations or different combinations of the same simple idea without the mixture of any other, as a dozen or score. So the examples of a dozen or a score, right? I mean, the example of a dozen is the same one that he just used in chapter 11. So clearly the example of a dozen, that is the idea formed by enlargement, is a form of, actually, let me switch back this for just one more second. So clearly the idea of a dozen, which is the idea of that's formed by enlargement, is an example of a simple mode. the question is whether every simple mode is an example of an idea formed by enlargement. And he doesn't quite say that here because he says there are some which are only variations or different combinations of the same simple idea. It's not clear whether variations and different combinations are supposed to be the same or if those are two alternatives. So, all right, now I'm going to switch back to this, and this, and this. Let me first talk about enlarging. And then afterwards, when I talk about space, there's going to be some reason to raise questions about whether enlarging really is the only way we form it or whether there's also others. So he slips in that thing about enlarging in chapter 11 as if it's the most obvious thing in the world, whereas it's actually really strange, I think, right? Because the view here is that to form the idea of something bigger, so like these three together are bigger than just this one. How do I form, here's my mind again. How do I form an idea that can refer to this bigger thing instead of just to one? It refers to all three. Well, I have to make a bigger idea. So to refer to a bigger object, I make a bigger idea. So, I add together the idea that refers to this one and the idea that refers to this one and the idea that refers to this one. And I make a bigger idea that's an idea of all three. Now, I mean, that's a little bit the wrong way of describing it, what I just said, because we're not talking about the idea of, we're not talking about like from the particular ideas of Beezer, the particular idea of Beezer and the particular idea of brandy, that I would form an idea of Beezer plus brandy, right? Like a brace of parrots or whatever. That would still be a particular idea. We're talking, and it would also be an idea of substance. It would be a collective idea of substance, as he classifies that. So, I mean, the ideas that refer to these things are not different ideas. Each one of them is the idea of unity. So when I was just thinking about this one, I used the idea of unity once, but now I want to think of all of them and how they're bigger than this one. So to do that, I make a bigger idea by putting in the simple idea of unity again and again. And presumably, the way I make the idea of a dozen is by, I mean, he says this pretty much, is by putting in 12 of them. Like, I mean, you can't even tell by looking at it. You have to count to know whether there's 12 or not. I don't think there is, but I just, anyway. So, but somehow the thought is that the way I form an idea of a dozen is by making a big idea that has a dozen unit ideas in it. And then the way I form the idea of a million is that I cram a million of these unit ideas together. There's a lot of weird things about this. One weird thing about this is, what does it mean that these are together? If they're all the same idea and I'm having them at the exact same time, how is there more than one of them? What does that even mean? But I guess somehow the answer is, well, that's an operation that our mind can perform, the operation of enlarging. Another question would be, so if this simple idea is unit, then this idea that's formed by enlarging it is the idea of a number, such as 3 or a dozen or whatever. So another question about this is this idea unit, is this the same as the idea of unity that earlier on he said is a simple idea, and it's a simple idea that accompanies all of our other ideas? Right, so this was first mentioned in chapter 7 of book 2, section 7, on page 131. What time is it? Maybe I better not show this in the document viewer. Oh, maybe I should. Existence in unity, and this is in the chapter where he's listing the ideas that come in both by reflection and by perception. And he says, existence and unity are two other ideas that are suggested to the understanding by every object without and every idea within. When ideas are in our minds, we consider them as being actually there, as well as we consider things to be actually without us, which is that they exist or have existence. And whatever we can consider as one thing, whether a real being or idea, suggests to the understanding the idea of unity. By the way, this is a place where he's making it sound like what we so to speak, perceive in reflection as ideas rather than operations of the mind. But I think that this is the place where he's speaking loosely, and those other places where he says it's the operation of the mind as the object of reflection are the ones where he's speaking precisely. So the point is, whether it's an internal thing, an operation of the mind, or an external thing, a body, whenever we consider it along with these two ideas of existence and unity. And the reason I think that's clearly the same as the idea of a unit that's involved in number is if we go to page 195, book 2, chapter 16, section 1. Amongst all the ideas we have, as there is none suggested to the mind by more ways, so there is none more simple than that of unity or one. By the way, I don't know what he means by there is none more simple. This doesn't seem to be a relative property. An idea is either simple or it isn't. I don't know why this one is simpler. But in any case, skipping a little bit, every idea in our understanding, every thought of our mind brings this idea along with it. Right? So this idea of unity, or of the simple idea of an unit, as he says, actually, oops. I've worried in the past about how I should read that. When he says, like, does this mean that at that time it was pronounced unit? And they said an unit? Or did they say an unit? Was this like an exception to the rule of when an N goes on the end of the indefinite article, or also possibly they said a unit, but they wrote the N because it looked better with the N. I don't know which of those is. All right, but in any case, so the simple idea of a unit is the same as this idea of unity that comes in with all our ideas. And right away that suggests something that might sound like kind of a paradox, but actually I think it's really helpful in understanding what the idea of a number is from Locke's point of view. So the reason it might sound like a paradox is this is an idea, right? This is I've drawn it with 4 units now, so it's the idea of the number 4. Every idea comes in along with the idea of unity. So this number 4 also comes in along with the idea of unity. I don't know what those little dots mean, like exactly what it means that it always comes with the idea of unity, but it does according to Locke. It's suggested by every idea. And so you might ask, how many units are there here then? Aren't there really 5? Right? Because there's the, chat went away again. There's the 4 units inside the idea of the number 4, and then there's this other unit, which is the unity of the number 4. But as I was saying, although that sounds kind of like a paradox, I think it's actually the key to understanding what's going on here. That a simple mode, just like any complex idea, is a complex idea because I'm taking it together as a unit on purpose. That is, this unity here that comes along with every complex idea is the same as that kind of voluntary unity that makes up the operation of compounding, that the infants and beasts don't do or don't do very much, and that is part of the process of our forming first complex and then abstract ideas. The process of it is assigning voluntarily a unity to some idea, to some distinct ideas. And in this case, all the distinct ideas are themselves the idea of unity, but the other unity is the one that I get it to have by making it. Okay, so in other words, the idea of number is, according to Locke, and for those few who were in my Kant course last quarter, you might recognize this, because I think Kant probably takes this idea from Locke. I mean, Kant thinks very highly of Locke. That's another example of a reason why maybe you shouldn't start to think that Locke is stupid, because Kant doesn't think he's stupid. But in any case, whether he got it from Locke or just had the same idea himself, Kant definitely follows Locke in this, and what they agree with each other about is the idea of number is the idea of unity repeated and then considered again as a unity. Right? Or it's the idea of what Kant calls totality. Right? It's the idea of things discerned, separated out from each other, and then added up together into a unity. That's the idea of number is. The idea of number is the abstract idea of doing that, because I just use the idea of unity, which comes along with every idea. So this is the idea of adding up anything to make a whole, to make a totality. of 4 parts. Okay, are there questions about that before I go on? Because now I'm going to talk about space. Space and time, but mostly space. Okay, well, so that's the account of number, but at first blush, it looks like it's going to be really hard to explain our ideas of space and time this way. Because this is how you might try to do it. You might think, so how can I draw this? Where's my eraser? Oops. So like, here's the idea of an inch. Now that's an example of a simple mode of, Locke uses a number of different terms for this. I think he believes the best term for what it's a simple mode of is expansion, but it's easier to say it's a simple mode of space, right? Anyway, it's a simple mode of continuous external quantity, as opposed to number, which is discrete quantity. So it's a simple mode. So, okay, we think we understand what that means. It means, remember, a simple mode is not a simple idea. A simple mode is a complex idea, but it's made up out of simple ideas. And it's made up, in particular, at least we think, it's supposed to be made up of the same simple idea repeated over and over again. So what is the simple idea that's repeated over and over again in the idea of an inch? So you want to say, if it's going to be analogous with number, that the simple idea that's repeated over and over again is the idea of the smallest possible space, right? Like unit space. Now, that is what Berkeley and Hume are going to say. But because of that, Berkeley and Hume are both going to deny that space is continuous or infinitely divisible. They're going to say space is, our idea of space is made up of smallest pieces, the smallest lengths we can imagine, and they're put together a finite number of times, and that's what gives us the idea of some particular amount of space. But Locke doesn't think that. I mean, by the way, if you think that, it has all kinds of weird consequences, right? Like, for example, that the Pythagorean theorem is not true, and all kinds of things like that. So, right, that is, it means that what we think of as theorems of geometry are not precisely correct. So it's not surprising that someone would not want to say that, and Locke doesn't want to say that. And in fact, he says in our reading, he says explicitly that he doesn't think we can form an idea of, he thinks that any idea of space that we have, no matter how small, we can consider it as divided. And we can't form an idea of the result of dividing infinitely many times. So, so this can't be the right account. even though he gives examples like this, right? Like going back to the case of enlarging, and he said, how many perches make a furlong? Again, I don't know how long a perch is and how long a furlong is, but a perch is shorter than a furlong. I can tell from the sentence. And, you know, he says the idea of a furlong can be made by adding together the idea of a perch, however many times you have to do that. So it sounds like it's supposed to be exactly analogous to number, but he can't think that because he doesn't think that we have a smallest unit space that we can add up to get whatever space we want. And by the way, if you go back to that furlong example, of course, he didn't say that, right? He didn't say we get the idea of a furlong by adding up zillions and zillions of smallest possible spaces. He says we got the idea of furlong by adding up so many perches. So the units that we were considering in that case were not indivisible pieces of space. They were themselves simple modes of space. So what's actually going on here? So I think the answer is that the simple idea of space is not an idea of a very, very small indivisible space. The simple idea of space is, so to speak, the idea of spaciness. So the idea of spaciness is just like what all spaces would have in common, or like what it's like to be a space. And the simple modes are not formed by adding the idea of space. So like this is the simple, I don't know, I mean, how can I draw this? You can't draw it. That's part of the point here. You can't draw it. The simple idea of space is the idea of spaciness, of being space. And you can't draw it because you can't draw space in general. You can only draw some determinate, limited space. And as soon as you draw that, you're drawing a mode, right? So this is some mode of space, means that this is some variation or derivative of this simple idea. And so that's why I called attention in that definition of simple modes to the fact that he seems to allow that there's something besides combination that goes into making up simple modes. And when we turn to the idea of space, it seems like that must be what's going on here, that the idea of space by itself doesn't imply any particular size or shape. And whenever we think of a space of a particular size of space, shape, that's a mode of the simple idea of space. So what happens when we form something like the idea of a furlong is, or rather there's like kind of two different ways we can have the idea of a furlong. We can have the idea of a furlong as a unit. And that means that we have this simple idea, this simple mode of space along with the idea of unity. We've taken, I guess this doesn't look like a furlong, but a furlong is long, and this is the idea of a furlong. So the idea of a furlong as a unit is just this simple idea, this simple mode of space, together, of course, with unity, which we always supply whenever we form an idea, or which always comes in whenever we receive an idea. So, but it's also possible to take some other unit, like a perch, and measure the furlong out in perches and attach the idea of unity to that. And in that case, we do use the operation of enlarging to form the idea of a furlong. But again, I guess you could say that can only go back so far. At some point, you have to arrive at a unit that you're just regarding as a unit. And how do we get an idea like that in the first place? Do I have time to talk about this? I have time to talk about it, but only if I skimp on talking about infinity, which is kind of important. They're both important. Maybe I'll talk about infinity a little bit at the beginning next time and thereby get myself off kilter. But so, so what I want to say about this is that let's talk about the objects that cause this simple idea in us. How do we get the idea of space? Locke says that we get it by perceiving the distance that there is between two things. So, so we perceive these two things, and each of them has certain qualities that cause in us certain ideas. Now, the distance between them as such doesn't cause anything in us, right? That is, space by itself doesn't have qualities by which it can affect us. At least I think Locke thinks that. I'm sure Locke thinks that, right? The difference between bodies and empty space is that a body has the quality of solidity that fills up space, and an empty space doesn't have the quality of solidity that fills up space. Maybe it has some other quality, but remember, we're limited to the primary qualities here, right? So the other primary qualities are bulk, figure, motion, etc. Those by themselves, we couldn't perceive them unless the thing that has them is also solid. I mean, if we were trying to perceive it by touch, let's say. So we're trying to perceive this space by touch. We can't perceive its shape or size or anything else unless it resists our hand. That's the only primary quality that I don't know how to explain exactly. I want to say it's the only qualitative primary quality, but that's kind of weird. But anyway, so the space by itself never causes any perception in us. So where do we get the idea of space? We get the idea of space by the separation between what we perceive here and what we perceive there. Now, I mean, I'm going to some length to emphasize this because we'll see that Hume, when he talks about the possibility of a vacuum, essentially agrees with Locke about this, as I'm understanding Locke, but then draws some very strange consequences from it. So what this means is that the idea of this whole space has to come in together, so to speak, right? That is, we don't get it by adding up its parts, because its parts don't cause any sensation in us, don't cause any perception in us. So we certainly can't separate them out and add them together. right? That is, so we must get this all at once by seeing the gap between the things we sense here and the things we sense there. Now, by the way, we don't have to, for this explanation, assume that there really is a vacuum when we first get the idea of space. But the point is that whatever is in here, we're not counting. Right? That is, when we regard these things as marking out a distance between them, we're not paying attention to anything, any bodies that might be between them. And that's why we're getting the idea of space by itself. And insofar as we don't think of what's in here, that makes it even more obvious, I guess. Insofar as we don't notice what's in there is not causing perceptions in us. So we always get the idea of what comes in is always a simple mode of space as a unit. So to begin with, the unit is just whatever interval of space is perceived as undivided. And again, that's how the idea of space comes in empirically, according to Locke. I think this explains why, when he comes to talk about divisibility, so this is in chapter 17, on page 204. Did I not mark this? Chapter 17, section 12, page 204. Oh yeah, here it is, but I didn't mark it. Oops. And since in any bulk of matter, our thoughts can never arrive at the utmost divisibility, therefore, there is an apparent infinity to us also in that which has the infinity also of number. So why am I pointing out this passage? He doesn't say, when he talks about the infinity of composition, the infinity of largeness, he always talks about space. Right? So he'll say, we form this idea, and like I said, I'll have to talk about this more next time because there's some weird things about this, but he says we form this idea of infinitely large space by first forming the idea of some really big space, like a zillion light years, and then adding it to itself over and over, and then noticing that we could always keep on adding it to itself as long as we wanted to. So like I said, there's many weird things about that. Like, why do you have to start with a big one? Why do you have to add it to itself first? How do you know that you can always keep on doing it? Etc. But leaving that aside for a moment, when he talks about that, he always talks about space. But here, in the passage I just read, when he talks about divisibility, he says, in any bulk of matter. Let me read it again without switching cameras. Since in any bulk of matter, our thoughts can never arrive at the utmost divisibility. So what can be added to itself is space in general, but we can be divided as only body, I think is what he's saying. Okay, that's kind of the end of the topic. And the next thing I would have to talk about is infinity, but there's no time to really start on that even. So are there questions about anything? Okay, so I guess we'll end here and I'll see you on Monday.